Welcome to the Profitable Farmer Podcast, where it's all about increasing the profitability of your farm by working smarter, not harder.
Welcome once again to Profitable Farmer. This is Jeremy Hutchings. It's great to have you listening in from wherever you are around Australia. Firstly, a shout out to Peter and Renee Burke from Mayfield Jerilderie. It was wonderful to be with you yesterday and over 100 rice farmers from your region. One, celebrating your accolade of Rice Grower of the Year. And secondly, just a shout out to you for how open you were in, I guess, your contribution to that day and your willingness to share some of the secrets that have underpinned your family and your business's significant development over 20 years and your successes in the last 2 years particularly, which have been two of the toughest years that I think the industry and rice growers have faced. And for you guys to navigate, record profits and the results that you have achieved is a real credit to you both. So thanks for having me involved in that. And again, Peter and Renee, congratulations. Now, the last podcast that I did has received great feedback, and that was with my brother talking about learning from the top end of town and understanding some of the secrets to strategy and growth of some of the biggest food and fibre businesses in Australia. With that feedback and in the spirit of keeping it locally, I thought I'd have this conversation focusing in an interview with my father. Now, Tim Hutchings is well known to many in the Riverina. He has been a highly successful farmer, a Nuffield scholar, a leading farm consultant to the region for probably over 30 years, and a very capable and effective individual when it comes to farm advice, farm strategy. And since leaving agriculture, he has completed his PhD analysing and uncovering some of the secrets to navigating risk and driving out flexibility or volatility, I should say, in farming systems, and looking at ways perhaps we can actually create consistent long-term profit and wealth from farming systems rather than being exposed to the vagaries of the seasons and the vagaries of the markets. And so it's with that in mind that I'm really excited to take some time in this in this podcast to speaking at length with my father. So Tim, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Thank you. I'm honoured to be in such good company.
It's great to have the opportunity to share, I guess, your background and some of your insights, I guess, having been in farming for so long, having consulted to so many farmers for so long, and to have since done so much research and analysis through your PhD into risk and volatility and how to drive that out of farming systems. And so perhaps before we get into the detail, Tim, 12 years ago, made the decision to retire from Dalry and move away from farm production. What are some of your fondest memories of farming at Yearon Creek and on Dalry?
I really, it's the most rewarding occupation I think you can have, as you all know. I particularly enjoyed breeding sheep. Breeding sheep, because we actually achieved an amazing amount. We more than doubled the profitability of sheep over about 15 years of breeding, so that you could see the difference across the age groups when you analysed it. The maidens outperformed the old ewes, and I think that's extraordinary.
Yep, and the dual purpose Centre Plus Merino is now coming up as being a highly profitable enterprise in and of its own right, and I know that was true for us back in the day. So Tim, just to launch into this, what I'd like to explore today is risk and agriculture and how we can stabilise the revenue and the profits coming from our farming systems. would you mind just giving us a bit of background specifically into your PhD, what you researched there, and probably first how you went about it, and then later on we'll get into the results. So what were some of the key, what was the intent and the purpose for your PhD?
It began because as a consultant, my budgets were no more reliable for other farmers than they were for myself, because there's so much variability. And I really wanted to get a handle on that. It's something that I've been playing with for many years before I actually did the PhD. But I was able to develop a system where I could actually quantify the variability and the effect of the variability on farm incomes.
Yes, would it be fair to say, Tim, that that's never been done before? No one has ever necessarily been able to quantify the financial risk of seasonality and variability within and between seasons in agriculture. Is that a fair statement?
It is in agriculture. Part of the reason that I was prompted to do this is my other two sons are both in banking and finance, and they could discuss the variability of and the risk involved with interest rates, etc., down to decimal points. And I thought agriculture is far riskier than finance. Why can't we do that?
And bringing some of that volatility and variability assessment tools, Monte Carlo and others, out of the finance sector and applying them to agriculture is really pioneering, and we'll get into the detail of that. So, Tim, how do you reflect? And I know there were a lot of outcomes to come from your research, but could you give us the snapshot of your findings, perhaps in a couple of key points?
I think that the main finding, which is common sense when you look at it backwards, but you don't realise when you're in the actual industry itself, is that debt accumulates at three times as fast as profit. So that, or that's because interest rates on debt are three times as high as interest rates on credit. And also the top is taken off your income by tax, so that you've got this bias in agriculture, which we have to overcome. And that is quite difficult.
So what does that mean in layman's terms? Just help me understand exactly. I get that that's a really key point, but what does it mean practically?
It means that to continue growing your wealth and growing your income, you have to actually be able to recover from one drought before the next one hits. And because costs to the debt that follows a drought grows faster than the profits that follow a drought, you actually have to make quite a rapid recovery.
Okay. So is that saying too, Tim, that losses year on year have a bigger impact to the negative in farming systems typically than profits year on year have on the same farming systems?
Yes.
Okay.
I think. Well, that's from two reasons. One, there's this bias in the growth, but also that if you don't get an income in any one year, such as many people are experiencing this year, then the loss is greater than the profit you potentially could have made.
Yep. It's a really interesting point. And it does, when we look at it at that really high level, looking down, makes sense, because the ongoing interest cost on the accumulated debt kind of compounds to the negative, whereas potentially you don't get the compound effect to the positive when you have 2 or 3 years of profits. Is that fair?
That's exactly what I was saying.
Yeah. Yep. So it's a really interesting point, I think, for us all to consider, is that losses year on year can have a greater impact to the negative than profits year on year have. And I know one of my farm mentors from northwest of New South Wales has always maintained, and speaking to him recently, he mentioned this again, that if you can break even and get by in a drought year or a potential loss year, if you can break even in the loss years, then you have a farming system that can stand the test of time. So for me, what that says is that farming is actually perhaps more about minimising losses and setting up our farming systems in order to achieve that than they are about making maximum profit in good years. Is that a fair comment, Tim?
I think that's probably the same for any business, but particularly because our variability in agriculture in Australia is so high, it's more emphasised.
Yep. So a lot of our focus, and I think perhaps with a push towards intensive agriculture and a move towards high input cropping, and lots of bright and shiny gear with good technology, self-steer, etc., that there's a push towards maximising yield and perhaps revenue per hectare or per acre. Is that a bit? I guess that push that often agronomically we have towards maximising yield and maximising revenue per hectare, could that actually be sending us, if our focus is on that, in a direction that is setting ourselves up to make bigger losses in the average and below average years? Is that dangerous, do you think, going after maximum yield per se?
It wouldn't be if, this is in a negative, but it wouldn't be if we had a less variable climate. If you have irrigation and reliable water, then your risks are much lower and you can afford to go for the doctor. But if you have a variable climate, such as we have, then you have to be a lot more careful. You have to concentrate on maximum flexibility and reducing your costs much more than maximising your income. That's not to say that you shouldn't try. But just adding what you know may be excess inputs in the hope of that extra margin is not a wise policy.
Okay, and that's key. I think flexibility is the thing that I want to speak about today. A lot of farming systems that we see perhaps are set up such that there's a cost base and a focus that limits flexibility and adaptability to the prevailing season. So, Tim, what are some of the things we can do to bring greater levels of flexibility to our farming systems?
Well, you can do what other businesses do, and the banks are one good example. But Woolies and Bunnings the same. They don't own their own real estate, which is a fixed cost to them. They make it a variable cost by leasing it, so that it's a smaller total cost with less risk. Another example is transport firms that don't own their own trucks or their aeroplanes. Qantas doesn't own any of its aeroplanes. Yeah.
So if we look at this in three levels, you've sort of started talking about our capital allocation. So if we think about plant and machinery, one way to adjust our cost structures such that in the poorer years we don't incur. I mean, if I own all my plant, my cost base is consistent and static year on year. So I guess what we're talking about is how to make our cost structures more agile and more flexible. And so one way to do that is to contract so contract harvest, contract spray, compared to owning your own plant? I think that's what you're suggesting here.
Yeah, I think that, well, that's one move. I'll give you an example. In a normal year on my farm, and this is a few years ago, it used to cost me somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000 to pay a contract harvester to take the crop off. But in a drought year, and this is an actual example, it cost me $2,400.
Yeah.
So that your high fixed cost, which will stay at round about, for me, $50,000 a year in depreciation and machinery replacement, are variable, and they're related to yield.
Yeah.
So that makes, by definition, makes it much more flexible.
Yeah. So absolutely. So that does. It's worth investigating. So one of the levers or one of the tactics we could employ is to analyse contract harvesting versus owning our own header. Equally, contract spraying rather than engaging and owning all our own sowing gear, and even contract sowing rather than owning our own sowing gear. So that if in a below average season you choose not to sow as many hectares or acres, or you need to not apply as much fertiliser or put in that second or that third spray, that you are literally not incurring the costs of plant at all in those years. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. And most people, farmers, don't like what they see as the extra risk and expense of having a contractor in. But they don't watch the value peeling off their farm, their machinery, and the interest cost associated with that while they're not using it.
Yeah, so we have that double effect, if you like, of depreciating assets at the same time as us paying finance on that plant. So that's a way of looking at making our capital base and our plant perhaps more flexible with the season. What other things can we do to impact other line items in our cost structures to bring more flexibility to our costs?
Well, it's called just in time, and that applies to contracting and any other business. So that we have to try and delay our inputs for as long as possible agronomically. And I had a farmer here, one of my better clients, with whom I developed a system where he would sow his canola or his wheat in the autumn on the first rain and not put anything on it, not even fertilizer. When we were relatively sure of having adequate moisture in July, we could decide then whether to turn that crop into hay if there wasn't any moisture, or graze it if there was even less, or if there was adequate moisture, grow a good grain crop. Now, the figures, the agronomist will tell you that you lose yield by delaying the fertilizer. We found that if the soil nutrient level is fairly high, the loss of yield wasn't detectable. But the flexibility you got from that was terrific.
Yeah, especially I would imagine, Tim, in a mixed farming system where you've got that added option of sacrificing some of your cropping area for the benefit of your livestock enterprise. Is that a fair comment as well?
Yeah, and in actual fact, all the latest research says that there's very little loss of yield to grazing crops, particularly canola, if it's sown early and it's not grazed for too long. I think that data is pretty convincing now.
Yeah. Yep. So, Tim, what's your comment then about ways to stabilise income? So, driving the variability out of our income profile. We see a lot of people moving towards continuous cropping, perhaps in the lower rainfall areas, but even in the higher rainfall areas, people being very focused on perhaps one enterprise, even taking out fences and those sorts of things. What's your comment on the importance of diversity of enterprise and things like that? What tactics can we call on in order to stabilise revenue?
It's important to access as many markets as possible. It's not necessarily product. So that sheep, for instance, have more access more markets than cattle. Cattle have only got meat. Sheep have wool and meat, and the store market as well. So that just sheep tend to be more adaptable and variable, and less variable because of that one particular thing. But the other thing that works against cropping in particular is that in a normal economy, price and yield work in opposite directions, so they tend to self-cancel. So that if you're not producing much, you get high prices, and vice versa. In Australia, the price is set in America. So you've all probably experienced the fact that you can have high prices and high production and low prices and low production in the same year. And that adds to the risk. We don't have this self-compensating relationship between yield and price.
And it's your assessment that does exist in livestock enterprises?
No, not more in cropping enterprises.
Yeah,
we control the world in lamb and now.
Yeah. So the opposite of that is true then in livestock enterprises. So more favourable from that perspective. Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, at the moment in the livestock enterprises, the demand seems to be going up while the supply is going down following these droughts. So the outlook for the next few years should be very good.
Yep. One thing I'm experiencing with the farmers that I am connecting with is, and especially now that prices for wool and sheep and beef are as strong as they are, that there seems to be either a conscious or subconscious shift to livestock becoming the primary enterprise and cropping now becoming a bit of a secondary enterprise that can be called on or sacrificed at least a little bit in those average or lower performing years to support the livestock enterprises. Whereas I reckon 10 years ago, Tim, it was the opposite, where we were sort of making cropping the primary and keeping it isolated and separate from the livestock enterprise. Do you have a comment on that? Is that a fair observation, do you think?
Yeah, that's certainly the trend, but it's been the trend for a long time. And one of the reasons is the riskiness of the two. With livestock, you can stabilise your income. Wool income tends not to vary very much between years. And you can feed your livestock to keep their value up, so that you can have the opportunity in drought to maintain your income much more even, or keep it more even with livestock than you do with cropping.
So coming back to your PhD, and I know you looked at a whole lot of different locations. Could you just name a couple of those locations? And your analysis allowed you, as I understand, to kind of backwards analyse the probability of profit or loss in a certain region, given all conditions, and tell you what perhaps the best enterprise combination was in those regions. Could you just speak to that and maybe give us a couple of practical examples? For example, Holbrook, Temora, somewhere else. Just to give us a bit of insight to that piece of your analysis.
Okay. Let's give you some idea of how I did the analysis first. It's called Monte Carlo. What it does is get a budget and run it, or preferably a multi-year budget, and I did a 10-year budget, which automatically reacted to the yields and prices that I put into it. And the yields, to get the yields, I used the last 50 years of rainfall and converted that into yields. You can do it just using rainfall, or you can use something like Epsom to do it. And the same with the livestock. So that I was able to prepare series of 10 years of yields based on actual variability. And then I looked at the effect of all different combinations of prices multiplied by those all different combinations of 10-year series in those 50 years. So I got a probability curve.
Yeah. And so just to explain that, the model that Tim created called on hundreds of years of commodity price data and tens and longer years of rainfall data and ran every possible simulation of all of those combinations. So something like 80,000 scenarios through the model for a farm in a certain area to then predict the probability of profitability for that enterprise mix. And then we could change the enterprise mix and hit the button and have it run that Monte Carlo simulation again, which is another 80,000 potential simulations to look at which one had a higher risk profile. So what were some of the results, Tim?
The results were, as you'd expect, the higher risk or the most variable income came from the areas with the most variable rainfall, because rainfall drives pasture and it also drives crop production. And it showed that the closer you could get to the coast, the more stable your income was, which is no news. Is it really no news? What I did was to actually measure the effect of those things and find out what the most likely outcome was, and also the most important thing, what was the probability of loss, which is the one single most important outcome.
So can you give me an example of that in a specific farm or a specific location?
Yeah, I can tell you that for this area in the Riverina, there is or has been, and historically using this method, close to a 40 to 50% risk of loss. So that we're running on a very fine line using our current systems.
Is that true across all of the Riverina? There's a fair bit of diversity across the Riverina. Do you mean?
Well, should I say the southwest slopes, around the Wagga region.
So the Wagga region has a 40% likelihood of loss.
Yes.
And so, again, the tactics that we've spoken about to this point are ways in which to minimise that. Are there other tactics that you have looked into that help farmers in the southwest slopes reduce that percentage?
Yeah, there are a couple of standout examples. One I borrow from New Zealand and one from one of my own, or a couple of my own clients here. If you've got to be properly diversified, you have to have a source of income or profit that is not related to your farm income, and preferably moves in the opposite direction, so that you have the perfect example of that is a pig farm or pig operation on a grain farm, because what drives pig prices is the cost of grain. If the cost of grain is high, then pig prices tend to be low, and vice versa. Put them both together and you get a very stable income.
So, Tim, to your point, if 100% of our wealth creation strategy or profit intent is focused on purely a mixed farm or a farm with one enterprise, we're completely exposed to the vagaries of the industry. What I understand you're saying is to find a business that can complement that, or even off-farm income that complements that, perhaps is more important than we're giving it credit for, or have been giving it credit for to this point.
Yeah, a lot of farmers at the moment are buying extra area to gain economies of scale to help stabilise their income. I believe that that is wrong, that it would be much wiser to either or to buy a different type of farm or a different type, buy into a different type of business or investment. And I mean, there are all sorts of investments that don't require you to manage them or only manage them slightly, that will fill the gap left by some of the variability.
Yeah. So at some point in your stage of life as you progress in farming, diversification of your balance sheet off farm becomes incredibly important. But even in the lead up to that, finding a revenue stream that is outside and different from farming is critically important.
I think so. There was a leading farm accountant in New Zealand used to come and speak to farm groups in Australia, and his mantra was that you had to earn enough off farm to cover the shortfall of 2 droughts.
To cover the shortfall of 2 droughts. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So that if my gross profit or my loss is $100,000 year on year for 2 years, are you saying that in any given year I need to try and find $200,000 in off-farm income?
Or accumulate it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, right. It's a really interesting way to think about it. I've always had the view personally that if I can feed my family and educate my kids off farm, then my farm has a really significant chance of strong profitability. I wonder if, as farm business owners, we are giving enough energy and attention to the importance of complementing the farm with alternative revenue streams, as perhaps we should be to this point. What's your comment? I mean, a lot of the focus does seem to be on driving production, driving performance, driving efficiency in our farming systems. Do you think there's been a lot of focus on the importance of complementing the farm with another source of revenue?
Yes, I think what we've been doing is aiming for productivity, and back in the 50s and 60s, productivity was increasing so fast it was the best place to put your money. But now we haven't really increased our water use efficiency in cropping for the last 15 years. And our inflation's still going up. It's much wiser, I think, in terms of wealth creation, to invest in another business that is going to reduce the variability of your income. And I'll be really radical, and it's something that you can probably understand with the training you've had in the academy, is that if you're in debt and you sell assets, such as if you sell some of your farm and get rid of the debt, your balance sheet doesn't change. You have just reduced something that cost you a fair bit of money and replaced it hopefully with another asset that earns you that much or more. And your wealth hasn't changed, but your chance of growing your wealth might have increased significantly. So it's a matter.
Yeah. So for some farming families, the option to consolidate and reallocate a portion of your balance sheet to off-farm investment might be a good strategy. Yes,
but not necessarily sell the family farm or part of it, but instead of going and buying the farm next door, really have a good look at investing that same amount of money if you want to spend it in another complementary enterprise, or just straight in a different investment, which is less variable.
Yeah. And perhaps even more simply than that, it's about honouring and respecting the importance of a teaching salary or a nursing salary or a part-time salary achieved either by the husband or the wife off farm. It actually plays a really significant role, doesn't it, in stabilising income over a 10-year period?
And yes, and the funny thing is, it mightn't seem like much that if either of the couple go out and earn $30,000 or $40,000 or $80,000 a year off farm, which is for nurses and teachers in particular is not hard to do, but it's the margin. If you your profit may only be, your loss may only be 40,000. You can compensate and stop that debt accumulating by just putting a relatively small amount of money in, which is what Peter Alexander from New Zealand was talking about. You are only working at the margins. You're not working on the whole income or the whole costs.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Tim. Thank you. So have you any other insights to share? We've talked a bit about looking to make cost profiles more flexible, ways to stabilise revenue, ways to challenge ourselves to look at making our investment in plant and the costs of having plant more flexible in nature. And then the importance of off-farm investments and off-farm income, again, as a way of stabilising revenue. Have you got any other final insights on tactics that our listeners can employ, or at least do the deep thinking on, as to how to stabilise their farming system performance, especially in these drier and tougher periods?
Yeah, I think the main one there, and this needs a lot, you will have to give it a fair bit of thought, but work not on averages, average incomes, average costs, but work accumulating. So build a budget that works over multiple years, a minimum of 3, and preferably somewhere around about 10. So you could have a budget that runs 9 years in the past and 1 year into the future. And then you can get a good idea of what your risks are, what you can do, or what impact changing any of the settings has on the final outcome. I had a favourite trick. I had a 3-year budget. I used to keep my clients' accounts on a 3-year running budget. And I used to, if they wanted to or were thinking about an investment, I'd plug it into the final year and they said, right, now let's make the middle year a drought. And the result was quite dramatic. Quite often, it was okay. You could withstand that drought and still show a profit. But more often than not, just that 1 year drought was enough to blow the future margins and the likelihood of future margins. So just working on 1 year doesn't work. I mean, you don't want to run a 1 year rotation. You run a 6 or a 7 year rotation. And exactly the same should apply to your financial cash book analysis.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So I guess the question that I want to put to everyone listening to this podcast is quite simply, have I got a business model on farm and off farm that is set up such that I can minimise losses in a below average year? Is my farming system flexible and real-time adaptable enough such that in a below average rainfall year that we can cover our costs, hold our own, not corrode equity or take on debt, and set up to recover from the dry season well and move back to profitability quickly. If you have concern around your response to that question, then I think it's really good timing to look objectively at the enterprise mix that you have, the cost structures that you're carrying, the nature of the revenue that is coming in, and how to make adjustments to that allow you to be more successful in minimising losses rather than that focus on profit at all cost. Tim, a final comment from you before we wrap up?
Well, what I've been saying is common practice. I don't know whether Jono, my son that you heard the other day, had said it, but all these principles are being run and used by all other businesses, and farming is a business that you can read about other businesses. Go and read about Steve Jobs and how he almost sent Apple broke because he forgot about cash flow. It's exactly the same for farming.
Yeah.
Except that ours is a more complex business than most because it's a biological business. It's unpredictable on that basis. It's unpredictable on the weather basis. So we have to develop systems which can handle that extreme level of variability and pay the freight to our markets.
Yeah, no, great comment. Thank you. It's interesting because so many of us in farming, we're focusing on making profits. And I think what you're sharing with us and through your research, that perhaps our focus first should be on minimising losses, but having the ability to make perhaps modest or optimum profits, not necessarily maximum profits in the good years, which is perhaps a more conservative approach to how we navigate the industry that we're in, given it's unique, than perhaps some of us are thinking about to this point. So thanks, Tim. Really appreciate your time. It's nice to, you and I talk about these things a lot over dinner and as we travel around the countryside together, but it's really nice to check in on some of this thinking that I know you consistently and constantly apply to the industry. I know your PhD was designed so that you could, I guess, create at least a bit of a legacy and give back to an industry that's been very good to you, and extend perhaps your learnings that came from your Nuffield Scholarship and your farm consulting over the years. So thank you for sharing that. And to all of our listeners, if you would like to learn more about some of the things that we've spoken about today, please reach out to the Farm Owners Academy with questions. We'd love to help you. And certainly as part of the journey that our clients are going on, a very robust critique of your financials, a really comprehensive critique of your current reality and your business models and your risk profiles, and then supporting you to generate really strong long-term cash flows and make major changes to the way you set your business models so that you can be more profitable, take more control, and move towards having more freedom, is front and center for the support we are extending to our clients. And so if that's of interest to you, please jump onto our website, pick up the phone, speak to us, and let us help find you a program within our range of support programs for farmers that can help you make a start in this direction. Tim, thanks again.
Thank you very much. I hope that I've made sense, and if anybody wants to actually develop this with me anymore, I'd be quite willing to talk to you.
Yeah, great. Well, let's look into that. Absolutely. Thanks for your time, Tim. To all of you out there, keep navigating this season. stay strong in the lead up to this Christmas. Enjoy a wonderful and festive season with your families, and look forward to connecting again early in the new year. Take care, thank you, and bye for now.